and welcome to Rocks Lesson 6, the final lesson in this topic. And today we're going to be looking at evidence for a changing Earth. My name is Mrs. Chiverton and I'm going to be taking you through this final session. Please make sure, as always, that you have either your exercise book or a piece of paper, a pen, pencil and ruler in order to record information as we go through. There will be some prompts to help you with this, and you can obviously pause the video at any point if you need more time to record the information. So our starter today to get our brains working is all about keywords from this whole topic on rocks, but I've been a bit mean and I've removed the vowels. So what I want you to do is solve that problem by adding vowels to work out what these words mean. And here's a second lot for those of you who want a little bit more of a challenge. And I'm going to give you about 1.5 minutes to complete that activity. Right, hopefully that's got you thinking and you've put your A's, your E's, your I's, your O's and your U's in the correct places. So let's see if you got them all correct. So the first one, we should have ended up with sedimentary rock. And then sediment. The third one is weathering, magma and strata. That was a bit of a tricky one there. And for those of you who extended yourselves, we should have had metamorphic, fossil, lava, igneous and volcano. So hopefully you all got 10 out of 10 and you're raring to go on the next bit of learning. So our learning outcomes today, our challenge outcome is to be able to describe the rock cycle and to be able to describe the process of continental drift. And our Aspire learning outcome is to be able to link evidence to prove the theory of continental drift. So again, just a little bit of a reminder and a review about our 3 rock types and which of them is sedimentary, metamorphic and igneous and the characteristics of those. So looking at these chocolate bars, which ones should you be able to match up? Which is igneous, which is metamorphic and which is sedimentary? Just a moment to think about that. There's no need for you to write down the answer of this one. It's just for a little bit of fun and to get our minds working. And you might find the pictures there of the chocolate bars a little bit of a clue. Okay. So we should have thought that our crunchy bar is igneous rock. It's made where a liquid sugar is cooled down, just like the liquid magma or lava cooling down to form crystals. We've got metamorphic rock here for our Cadbury's marble, and we can actually see that with those squished together layers and no clear crystals. And then finally we've got our sedimentary rock there with our very, very clear layers and gaps and holes and spaces in between the actual particles that make up the rock. So in order to understand the rock cycle and how the different types of rocks turn into each other, we have to remind ourselves about how they're formed. This table would allow you to summarise that and pull together the information that we've learnt from previous lessons. If you wish to copy this table down, I'm going to give you a minute. If you don't wish to, you can forward through the video. So we're going to look at each of the types of rock in turn. So a reminder of sedimentary rocks. Sedimentary rocks, typical examples are things like sandstone, limestone and conglomerate. And it's a series of processes that form sedimentary rocks. So we have weathering, usually at the tops of mountains and other areas. Those particles that are broken off from the larger chunks of rock are transported, often by gravity or by rivers. We have deposition, where those sediments, those particles, are laid down in a particular area and they're buried, and then the pressure from the rocks above cements those rocks together to form sedimentary rock. With metamorphic rock, we need to remember that it's formed by a combination of heat and pressure on other rocks. So it can be pressure from rocks above and heat from nearby magma. And we know that all other types of rocks, sedimentary and igneous, can be turned into metamorphic rocks. And examples there are slate, quartzite and marble. And the typical characteristics, we often see those layers, but we rarely see fossils, and usually they're distorted. The final type of rock are igneous rocks, and we know that they're associated with magma or lava. So there we have got that liquid rock that then cools down and solidifies. And we know that there's the two types. If the lava or magma cools down quickly, it forms small crystals. That's our extrusive igneous rock. And an example of that would be obsidian. And if the lava or magma cools down much more slowly, it will have bigger crystals. And a typical example of that would be granite, where you can see the different size crystals. There is another type of igneous rock called pumice, which we've not mentioned before. This is where magma is thrown out of the top of a volcano, and it forms very, very quickly. And pumice is actually so light that it will float in water. So here is our summary about the three types of rock, how they are formed and what their general appearance is. If you want to amend your summary that you've made, check what you've done, you can take about a minute to do that now. If you wish to make notes and it's going to take longer, just pause the video and you can do that as well. So through the rest of the video, you will need to record some information about the key ideas that are going to be introduced to you in this lesson. Again, as I've done in previous lessons, I've given you some sentence starters, and I will give you prompts throughout the video to allow you to record that information. The first one we're going to look at is the one about the rock cycle.
Once upon a time, there were two brother rocks. They sat on Earth's surface until one day they were weathered and eroded into small pieces called sediment. The brothers and all their pieces were picked up by a river and carried far, far away from their home. Eventually, the river dropped them and deposited them into the ocean. Many layers of sediment continued to build up on top of them, putting tremendous pressure on the brothers. Each layer was squeezed together, cementing the little pieces together to form sedimentary rock. The layers continued to build, pushing the brothers deeper and deeper under the earth. It was very hot, and there was a lot of weight on top of the brothers. This heat and pressure caused the brothers to change into metamorphic rock. The temperature kept rising, and the brothers got so hot that they melted. This hot liquid rock is called magma, and it is able to move around. The brothers enjoyed their time as magma, floating around inside the earth. But one day, one of the brothers was forced to the surface again in a volcanic eruption. This caused him to cool down very quickly, making him into a fine-grained, extrusive igneous rock. The other brother was left under the Earth's surface for a long, long time, and he cooled off very slowly, forming large crystals. He became an intrusive igneous rock. Eventually, through a process called uplift, the second brother was brought to Earth's surface again and was reunited with his brother once again. Sometime later, it began to rain again, and the process started all over.
So, in summary, the rock cycle is a continuous dynamic process. Constantly, rock is being weathered and eroded, transported, buried and turned into sedimentary rock. At the same time, both igneous and sedimentary rock are being acted on by the heat from the planet and pressure from above and being turned into metamorphic rock. And similarly, both metamorphic and sedimentary rock can be melted into magma, which is then turned into either extrusive on the surface or intrusive igneous rocks. And uplift and movements of the earth crust are constantly moving and causing these processes to occur. So, you should now be able to summarise the rock cycle. You might want to sketch a diagram of it to help with your understanding. And I'm going to give you 1.5 minutes to complete that activity. Okay, so in the next 2 sections, we're going to look at somebody called Wegener and his theory of continental drift, and in particular, the evidence that supported that theory. So this is very recognisable as our current globe, with all of the continents that we would expect to see: Europe, Asia, America, South America, and so on. But there is evidence that our planet has not always been like this. So the Earth's surface, we know, is not smooth. It's covered in mountains and valleys all over our planet. And originally, in the olden days, scientists thought that these structures were formed due to the Earth shrinking as it cooled after it was formed many millions of years ago. You can see that kind of thing happening if you have custard that's really hot and it goes cold and it gets a wrinkly surface on. And that was their evidence for that. And it was the best theory that they could come up with the evidence that they had. But now, of course, scientists think that the Earth's surface is split up into these big chunks called tectonic plates, and mountains are actually formed when those tectonic plates collide. So how did we get from our original understanding to our modern day theories? How did our understanding change? Now, the theory of modern tectonics has been a long time in the making. Right back in 1620, Sir Francis Bacon mentioned that when looking at maps, South America and Africa, the shapes of the continents could actually fit together. In 1655, Antonio Schneider was another scientist who actually published sketches of those two things actually fitting together. And much later, Benjamin Franklin, another famous scientist, actually mentioned the crust of the Earth being a shell floating on a fluid interior. That was from observations of earthquakes and volcanoes and so on. And the surface of the globe would be capable of being broken and disordered by violent movements of the fluids on which it rested. And again, this was based on scientific evidence, but nobody put the whole idea together until we got to Alfred Wegener. So he was the German scientist who put these ideas together, that the Earth's surface is not stable and it's actually made up of moving parts. And he did this in 1912. And he proposed this theory known as the theory of continental drift. And what he proposed was that 300 million years ago, there hadn't been separate land masses on our planet, just one supercontinent. And the landmass, called Pangaea, then broke into smaller chunks and gradually moved apart. And he claimed that these chunks were still slowly drifting and are still moving. And this is what he proposed that Pangaea looked like, with South America and Africa joining together, North America being brought down, and Europe and Asia also being joined together. And he had lots of evidence for this. He came across some work listing fossils of very similar plants and animals being found on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean, so on South America and on Africa. And one of the examples of this was a freshwater crocodile. And he suggested that at some point these two continents must have been joined together, because it's very unlikely that two such similar species would evolve separately on completely different land masses. He investigated further and he found other cases of similar fossils on opposite sides of the oceans. And he also pointed out this jigsaw match that these two continents could actually be put together. And he considered that they'd been one continent and then had split. And he looked for even more evidence and he found it. So this was how he suggested some of our current continents actually fitted together, with gaps where it wasn't apparent that the edges met, filled with smaller island masses. And this was some of the evidence that he collated. So not only did he find fossils of plants and animals that actually mapped bands across those different continents and land masses that he'd suggested were originally joined together, but he also found rock types in those areas that also matched up. So they were matching layers of rocks in different continents, and he also found evidence of fossils that appeared to be in what we would now consider the wrong places. And one example of this was tropical plants that had been found as fossils on Arctic islands, where the present very cold climate would clearly have killed them off, and therefore they wouldn't have been able to survive there. And there were other examples of this. So he went ahead and he proposed his theory. These continents look like they fit together. They also have similar rock patterns and fossil records. And these two pieces of evidence have led me to believe that there was once a single landmass, and this is my tectonic theory. So you should be able to now explain what Wegener's theory of continental drift states, and also point out some of the evidence that he used to support that theory. And I'm going to give you 2 minutes to record that information. So by 1915, Wegener felt he had enough evidence and he published his theory of continental drift. When scientists publish scientific papers, they are open to something called peer review. That's when other scientists look at the theory and what evidence has been presented and say whether or not they think it's strong enough for them to support the theory or to go against the theory. So the reaction to Wegener's theory was less than positive. In fact, some scientists were actively hostile. Part of this was possibly because he wasn't a qualified geologist and they felt he didn't have a right to publish in a field that he didn't understand or wasn't qualified in. A few scientists did support his ideas, but most of them didn't see any reason to believe such a strange theory. They actually thought what he was saying was quite bizarre. There were two main reasons why other scientists thought that Wegener's theory was wrong. And the first one was that he couldn't actually explain how the continents moved. At the time, other scientists thought that the continents were fixed and couldn't move, and we didn't have the scientific equipment to actually measure any movements. So Wegener didn't have any evidence that the continents were actually moving. It was just a theory. He thought that the continents were ploughing through the seabed and their movements were caused by tidal forces and the Earth's rotation, and other geologists said that this was impossible. And in fact, one scientist calculated that the forces needed to move the continents like this would have actually stopped the Earth rotating, which it obviously hadn't. So this was one big sticking point with people believing Wegener. He simply couldn't prove the movement of the continents or give a realistic mechanism by which they were actually moving. The second reason that people didn't believe Wegener was that an alternative explanation called land bridges could explain a lot of the evidence that he had proposed. So his evidence was based, as we've said, on similar fossils being on opposite sides of oceans and matching rocks of layers being on different continents. People had noticed this previous to this, and back in 1920, other scientists had come up with a different theory, the theory of a land bridge. They thought that had once been pieces of land linking the continents, land bridges. So animals had been able to cross these land bridges, explaining the different fossils on different sides of oceans, and that the bridges had later sunk or been covered over since then. So this is what they had proposed, that actually there were land bridges linking South America and Africa, and that, as we've said, the animals could walk across this land bridge, meaning that similar species were found at both sides of the Atlantic Ocean. And scientists therefore said, if his evidence could be explained by a different, more believable theory, why on earth should they believe Wegener's new theory of continental drift? And this often happens when new theories are suggested by scientists, that if there's already an existing theory that explains the evidence, they may be reluctant to change to a new theory. So at this point, you should be able to fill in the section about why Wegener's theory was not accepted at first. And I'm going to give you a minute to fill that information in. So Wegener became very frustrated and his theory didn't progress any further. And where was the proof that he so badly needed? And actually, it was right under his feet, and it just needed technology to catch up with his theory. So what was being born back here back in 1962? It was actually the island of Surtsey off the Iceland coast. Today, now a grand 58 years old. This landmass had not existed previous to this. So there's evidence all around the planet of this movement and change. We have fault lines like the Mid-Atlantic Ridge running all the way through the coast of Iceland and down through the Atlantic Ocean. We can see now underwater volcanic eruptions regularly along that Mid-Atlantic Ridge and other areas in and around the Pacific Ocean. We see new land masses forming like Surtsey as a result of volcanic eruptions under the sea. We have volcanic eruptions as well on land, causing changes and showing that pressures and so on are changing. Things like lahars and landslips causing changing in our Earth's crust. And volcanic eruptions changing the shape of mountains and so on. So when was Wegener's theory finally accepted? It wasn't until the 1950s, nearly 40 years after he'd originally published his information. And it was at this point that scientists were able to investigate the ocean floor and found new evidence that actually supported Wegener's theory. We now know that along ridges like the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, new seafloor is being produced on a regular basis as plates move away from each other and magma is able to come up to the surface and form new seafloor. This is known as seafloor spreading. So Wegener might not have been right about everything. His mechanisms for how the continents moved around wasn't correct, but his main idea of continental drift was correct. And by the 1960s, geologists had collected enough information to be convinced that his theory actually was correct. And now continental drift is the accepted theory about what's going on because we now have enough evidence to prove it. So you should now be able to record our reasons why Wegener's theory was finally accepted, and I'll give you just a minute to record that information. Okay, so now we do know that there is that evidence, that proof. We can now have machinery that can measure the movement of tectonic plates. And for example, every year America moves a few centimetres further away from Europe, and we can actually physically measure that. So another example we could use is our pyramids. We can measure that pyramids actually move about 5 millimetres a year. That's not very far. However, over 4,500 years, they would have moved a whole 22.5 metres, and in 600 million years, they would have moved nearly 2,000 miles. So that should give you the final piece of information to fill in on our summary. How far do the tectonic plates move on average in a year? So, if we track back through time using Wegener's idea of continental drift, we can see how the different continents have moved further or closer away from each other through time. Task 1 is to complete your Google quiz. Please use the notes that you've made to complete that quiz. And remember to keep those notes for when you return to lessons and to revise for future assessments. When you've completed task 1 on the Google Sheet, there's a second task about predicting the future. And scientists use computer models to make predictions about how things have changed over time. There's some diagrams coming up for you to use to describe what will happen to the Earth as continental drift continues for the next 250 million years. When you're doing your description, you need to include the relative position of the continents, or how are they changing, the changes to the climates that might cause. Think about them moving towards the poles or towards the equator, where we know it's much hotter, and any effect on wildlife that might result in, or climate changes. And these are the diagrams that you can use. Task 3 is an optional fun task about making your own fossils. So what you're going to need is 2 cups of flour, a cup of salt, half a cup of warm water, a bowl and a spoon to mix with. You can make more or less, just keep the proportions of the ingredients the same. And you're going to need some objects to make your impressions. Now this could be toys or anything you want to, really. So first of all, mix all of the ingredients together in a bowl until you get a firm dough. And then roll those pieces of dough into small balls and press to flatten them a little bit. Push the object you want to fossilise firmly into the dough. And then remove it carefully to try and avoid disturbing the impression that you've made there. Alternatively, you can make your dough into shapes like dinosaur eggs or bone shapes even. And then finally, to keep those shapes, you bake them in a low oven, about 150 degrees C, for 1 to 2 hours until hardened. And make sure you leave them to cool before you handle them. And then you're free to either decorate them or to bury them in a tray of sand or compost, and practice being a paleontologist and dig up your evidence for your fossils.